and I'd like to begin by thanking AFSA for inviting me to participate in this, the first of their series of digital book notes. And today I'll be speaking on my most recent book, The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West. The title of my talk, An Epic Shrouded in Myth, the Indian Wars of the American West. And even though this is a book talk, I would like to begin by talking about a movie. Now, some of you may recognize this scene, this iconic movie scene. In the background, we see Dustin Hoffman in the guise of an Army Indian scout, looking rather perplexed at an evidently self-satisfied, preening George Custer on the eve of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Now, this scene from Little Big Man has come to have an allegorical meaning for me. I like to think of myself as I began work on my book as Dustin Hoffman, the baffled Army scout, and George Custer as personifying the mythos of the Indian Wars. Of course, I had many questions, large and small, as I began my book. For instance, was George Custer a reckless glory hunter, as many believe? In this picture, we see Custer in the foreground, clutching a wound in his belly and wondering what the heck had just gone wrong at the Little Bighorn. Another question I had, was the famed Apache chief Geronimo truly an Indian hero? And was the climactic event of the Indian Wars, the tragedy at Wounded Knee, really a massacre, or was it something else? Well, I found that the mythology that surrounded the Indian Wars intruded on these and all the other questions I had, and it is the myths that have come to shroud the Indian Wars that I want to concentrate on today. To some degree, myth always distorts history, but the Indian Wars, I would argue, are uniquely susceptible. For 125 years, much of both popular and academic history, film, and fiction has depicted the period as an absolute struggle between good and evil, reversing the roles of villains and heroes as necessary to accommodate a changing national conscience. In the first 80 years following the tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890, which effectively marked the end of Indian resistance, the nation romanticized Indian fighters and vilified or trivialized the Indians who resisted them. The Army appeared as shining knights of an enlightened government dedicated to conquering the wilderness and to civilizing the West and its Native American inhabitants. No one conveyed that sentiment better than the cinematic duo of John Wayne and director John Ford. Well, in 1970, the story reversed itself, and the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme. Americans were developing a deep, acute sense of the countless wrongdoings that had been done to the Indians. D. Brown's elegantly written and passionately wrought Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an Indian history of the American West, and later that same year, the film, Little Big Man, shaped a new saga that articulated the nation's feelings of guilt. In the public mind, the government and the Army became seen as willful exterminators of the native peoples of the West. And so, in large measure, it continues in popular culture today. Now, in The Earth is Weeping, I have tried to bring historical balance to the story of the Indian Wars. Now, the first step, of course, to presenting a balanced history of anything is to strip away the mythos. Now, there are too many myths for us to discuss them all in this presentation. So what I'd like to do is address what I consider to be the three most egregious and commonly held myths, and here they are. Myth one, that the regular army was hell-bent on killing Indians. Myth two, that government Indian policy was exterminationist. And three, that the Indians united to resist the whites, the white encroachment in the West. Now, before we proceed with our myth busting, it's probably a good idea to orient ourselves in time and space. And I hope you're able to read this map or at least get the gist of it. This is the American West at the end of the Civil War. The era of the Indian Wars in my book is the period between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and 1890, nearly 3 decades of intermittent conflict. And it covers the lands west from the Missouri and Arkansas rivers all the way to the California border, spilling over north into Oregon and down in the southwest, all the way into the mountains of northern Mexico. Some of the tribes that we'll be talking about are the Lakota or Sioux Nation on the northern plains. You can see in the dark shading there. The Cheyenne on the plains, the Nez Perce of Idaho, the Modoc of southern Oregon, and the Comanche and Kiowa of the southern plains. So this is our region, the area west of the Missouri and Arkansas rivers to the California border, and then from Canada all the way south into Mexico. Okay, let's debunk these three myths, beginning with the fallacy that the regular army was eager to kill Indians. Well, this jaunty gentleman here is George Crook, and he was one of the premier Indian fighting generals in the West, perhaps the best Indian fighting general in the West, the most competent. During the height of the Indian Wars, a reporter asked him how he liked his job. "Not much," Crook replied. "It was a hard thing," the general explained, "to be forced to do battle with Indians who, more often than not, were in the right." Crook said, "I do not wonder, and you will not either, that when Indians see their wives and children starving and their last source of supplies cut off, they go to war, and then we are sent out there to kill them. It is an outrage. All tribes tell the same story. They are surrounded on all sides. The game is destroyed or driven away. They are left to starve, and there remains but one thing for them to do, to fight while they can. Our treatment of the Indian is an outrage." Now, that a general officer in the Army would offer such a candid and forceful public defense of the Indians may seem implausible today because it contradicts that enduring myth that I spoke of, that the Army was the implacable foe of the Indian. Let's consider these two distinguished old gentlemen for a moment in a photograph taken years after the hostilities ended. The man holding the hat is Chief Joseph. The man beside him is Colonel John Gibbon. Chief Joseph was the leader of a band of Nez Perce Indians who resisted a federal demand that they move on to a reservation in Idaho Territory. Blood was spilled, and the Nez Perce fled east. Well, Colonel Gibbon was ordered to intercept them. On the night of August 7th, 1877, Gibbon deployed his men on a high hill above the Nez Perce village at Big Hole in Montana Territory. With dawn several hours away and nothing to occupy his time, Gibbon meditated on the morality of his mission. He was probably sitting where we see in the foreground of the photo here. The Indian village was down behind the bend in the river Later, Gibbon shared with the Bishop of Montana the misgivings he had felt that night. Quote, knowing our peaceful disposition as you do, you can fancy us seated for hours in the darkness of the night, within plain hearing of a parcel of crying babies and the talk of their mothers and fathers, waiting for light enough to commence a slaughter, which we knew from the nature of the case must necessarily be promiscuous. We had ample time for reflection, and I, for one, could not help thinking that this inhuman task was forced upon us by a system of fraud and injustice, which had compelled those poor wretches to assume a hostile attitude toward the whites. The slaughter was all that Gibbon had feared it would be. 90 Nez Perce were killed or wounded in the Battle of Big Hole, among them several women and children. Gibbon lost nearly half his command and would have been wiped out had the Nez Perce not been more interested in continuing their flight toward Canada than they were in fighting. Now, Crook and Gibbon were far from the only high-ranking officers to protest the injustice that was done the Indians. General John Pope, who commanded the huge Department of the Missouri, actually suggested that soldiers be sent to help the Indians eliminate buffalo hunters. The buffalo hunters had decimated the herds of western Kansas, and in early 1874, as Pope wrote, they set up shop in an abandoned trading post on the Texas Panhandle called Adobe Walls, and they resumed the killing of Indian buffalo on reservation land. Indian land, buffalo herds that had been promised the Indians in perpetuity to supplement their meager government rations. Unfortunately, few beside the Indians cared about the slaughter. In fact, General Pope's superior officer, General Philip H. Sheridan, reveled in the slaughter. He told the Texas State Assembly, which was considering a buffalo conservation bill, that the hide hunters had done more to settle the Indian problem in 2 years than the Army had done in 30. For the sake of lasting peace, let them kill and skin until the buffalo are exterminated. Well, Sherman assumed that the fighting spirit had gone out of the Southern Plains tribes. He was wrong. At dawn, on June 27, 1874, 500 warriors spilled down a steep ridge a half-mile east of Adobe Walls and made a dash to wipe out the despised buffalo hunters. The doors of the sod shacks slammed shut, and the 29 white men battled the attackers to a standstill. One buffalo hunter managed to slip through the Indian lines at night and rode to Kansas for help. The governor of Kansas appealed to General Pope to dispatch troops to raise the siege. Pope turned him down flat. Indians, like white men, are not reconciled to starve peacefully, he told the governor. The buffalo hunters have justly earned all that may befall them. If I were to send troops to that locality, it would be to break it up and not to protect the buffalo hunters. Well, Pope's response infuriated Sheridan, and he ordered Pope forthwith to send troops to raise the siege. In the meantime, however, the Indians had wearied of the costly struggle at Adobe Walls and withdrawn. Now, John Pope's principled stand nearly cost him his rank and his command. Brigadier General Edward R.S. Canby gave substantially more in the interest of justice. He sacrificed his life. It was April 1873. Canby was in the lava beds of Northern California, trying to bring an end to a standoff between 60 well-entrenched Modoc warriors and their families and nearly 400 soldiers. Let me say that again. A standoff had gone on for 6 months between 60 warriors and 400 soldiers. Warriors were ensconced in the lava beds in the background of this picture. I took this picture myself, actually. I walked this ground and can attest to how difficult it was. Well, the Modocs had legitimate grievances, as did most Indians. White ranchers, unwittingly abetted by the army, had driven the Modoc from a small parcel of land in southern Oregon that they had claimed as their own. Men died on both sides. In the interest of averting further bloodshed, General Canby agreed to a peace conference with the Modoc leader, Captain Jack, even though Canby's interpreter, who was a Modoc woman and Jack's cousin, had warned the general that treachery was afoot. On Good Friday, 1873, Canby, his Modoc interpreter, and her white husband, and 2 very frightened peace commissioners met Jack and several other Modoc warriors at a peace tent between the lines. Canby handed out cigars, and he said, "My Modoc friends, my heart feels good today." Those were Canby's last words. Moments later, Jack blew Canby's face off with a revolver. Canby was the only officer to die in the Indian Wars. And here at the cross we see marks the spot where Canby was shot in the lava beds. So, what are we to conclude from these episodes? The essential truth is that the plight of the Indians deeply disturbed most senior officers. Even Sheridan expressed regret at his duties at times. And that more often than not, they sympathized with the hostile Indians they were charged with subduing. Now, what may be said of government policy? Now, its wisdom and its morality may be questioned, particularly in light of the 21st century and our standards. But it cannot be said, and I make this point in my book strongly, it cannot be said that the government ever intended to physically exterminate the Indians, despite what many still maintain. If they had, my question would be, why are there Native Americans still living today? Again, myth 2, government Indian policy was exterminationist. This photo, by the way, you see here is of a peace delegation in Washington in 1863, and the woman with the bonnet far to you, the viewers, right, is Mary Todd Lincoln. Okay. Government Indian policy was not exterminationist. However, that the Indian way of life must be eradicated if the Indian were to survive was taken for granted. So in today's parlance, we can say that a cultural genocide of sorts evolved. Federal Indian policy actually evolved after the Civil War in fits and starts. When the war ended, neither the President, Andrew Johnson, nor Congress were able to fashion anything like a coherent Indian policy, which left things, as Commanding General William T. Sherman put it, to the caprice and the hazard. Rampant corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was a federal agency charged with overseeing Indian matters, compounded the problem. Here we have a period cartoon by Thomas Nast, the famous and prolific cartoonist who satirized nearly everyone and everything, picturing a fat and happy Indian agent and a starving Indian chief. A popular story was told at the time, in fact, of a chief who described his agent to General Sherman in these terms: "Our agent, great man, when he comes, he brings everything he owns in a small bag. When he goes, it takes 2 steamboats to carry them away." In 1869, a newly elected President, Ulysses S. Grant, famously declared with respect to the American Indians, "Let us have peace." He instituted a carrot and stick body of principles that came to be known as the peace policy. Grant replaced the corrupt agents with religious men, mostly Quakers, and with army officers. Here again, another Thomas Nast cartoon lampooning Grant's policy, caption being "Robinson Crusoe making a man of his Friday." So, as I said, Grant replaced corrupt agents, replaced them with religious men, especially Quakers, and with army officers. He established independent oversight of the Indian Bureau, and he appointed, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a full-blooded Seneca Indian, his former military secretary, Elias Parker. Well, Parker, he was an Indian, but he subscribed to the prevailing view of the day that the Indians' future, the Indians' only future, lay in acculturation. So Parker directed Indian agents to assemble the Indians in their jurisdictions on permanent reservations, well removed from the white overland travel routes and settlements, get them started on the road to civilization, and above all, treat them with kindness and patience. Now, Indians who refused to settle on reservations would be turned over to the military and treated as, quote, friendly or hostile as circumstances might justify, unquote. Now, although kindness and patience, not to mention common decency, were often lacking in the implementation, the principles articulated by Parker officially guided federal policy throughout the era of the Indian Wars. The end result, however, was the dispossession of Indian lands. A question that naturally arises is, how did the Indians respond to the broken promises, broken treaties, and relentless white encroachment on their lands? That brings us to the third enduring myth that I want to address. That is to say, that the Indians united to resist the whites. Now, the picture you see, the colorful picture you see here, is an example of what's called ledger art. And this is very popular among the Indians, especially the Plain Indians in the latter decades of the 19th century. They would take ledger books and draw illustrations of their most heroic deeds. It was kind of a memoir in pictures. And invariably, 90% of the time, the pictures they drew were of deeds of gallantry, war honors that they accumulated at the expense of other Indians. Here we see a Cheyenne Indian warrior running his lance through a Pawnee Indian warrior. And this picture, I think, graphically makes the point that the Indians not only failed to unite in opposing the westward expansion of civilization, but they also continued to make war on one another. And that is because intertribal warfare was simply too deeply ingrained in their cultures for them to do otherwise. There is no sense of what I call in the book, and I may have invented a word in the process, no sense of what I call Indianness until it was simply too late. During the course of the Indian Wars, an army captain asked a Cheyenne chief, who was a friend of his, why his tribe, why the Cheyennes preyed on their Crow Indian neighbors. The Cheyenne chief answered honestly. He said, we stole the hunting grounds of the Crow because they were the best. We wanted more room. Here in this example of ledger art, you see a Cheyenne Indian dispatching a Crow warrior. A Lakota chief told a government treaty negotiator something similar. He said to the government negotiator, "You have split my land and I do not like it. These lands once belonged to the Crow and the Kiowa, but we whipped these nations out of them. And in this we did what the white man does when they want the lands of the Indian." Now, these certainly were sentiments that acquisitive whites, determined to clear the West of troublesome Indians, could readily appreciate. So much for the notion of united Indian resistance. One thing that is commonly lost in the mythos of the Indian Wars are the numerous tribes that actually accepted the white presence and went a step beyond and actively fought with the army and with the government against other tribes, against their tribal enemies, sort of along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Let's take, for example, the Pawnee of Nebraska. The Pawnee were vitally important to construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. In the summer of 1867, as those of you who have watched the series Hell on Wheels will know, the Lakota and Cheyenne, through their war parties and raids on work crews, had essentially brought construction on the Union Pacific to a standstill. The Army proved incapable of stopping the fast-moving war parties, and so a battalion of Pawnee warriors were recruited as soldiers. Here's in this painting, you can see members of the Pawnee Battalion awaiting orders. Well, the Pawnee Battalion proved so effective in mauling one large Cheyenne war party that raids on the railroad came to an abrupt halt and work resumed unimpeded until the railroad was completed. And I think it's fair to say that the presence of the Pawnee Battalion shaved at least a year off the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and probably at least 2 seasons off Hell on Wheels. Now, as destructive as the fighting between tribes was, what ultimately doomed Indian resistance was the inability of individual tribes to maintain cohesion among themselves against the white threat. Only those tribes that accepted the white presence, like the Pawnee and the Crow and the Shoshone, were united. None of the tribes that are famous to us have come down to us as famous for fighting the government, such as the Lakota or the Cheyenne or the Apache, were ever unified for war or for peace. Each tribe had its war and its peace or accommodationist faction. These factions struggled constantly for dominance in tribal affairs, sometimes clashing violently with one another. The Kiowa of the Southern Plains offer a particularly tragic example of a tribe torn asunder. This young chief you see here is someone I grew very fond of in writing my book. He's one of the principal characters in the book. His name is Kicking Bird of the Kiowa. Well, he headed the tribe's peace faction. He almost single-handedly kept the Kiowa out of the so-called Red River War, which was the conflict that erupted after the fight at Adobe Walls, and which was the climactic war for the Southern Plains. Despite Kicking Bird's ability to keep most of the Kiowa out of the war, the Army nonetheless put him in an untenable position. The government had decided that the Red River War would be the last struggle in the Southern Plains, and so they came up with the idea of identifying instigators of the war and imprisoning them in Florida for a year or two to make an example of them. Now, to my way of thinking, they should have rounded up the buffalo hunters and incarcerated them in Florida, but instead the government establish a quota of Indians from the various tribes involved, including the Kiowa. Kicking Bird argued against this, saying, look, we played a small part in this conflict, but nonetheless, he went ahead and identified a number of members of the tribe for imprisonment. To ease the burden on the tribe, he chose mostly Mexican captives and tribal delinquents. But he also selected a vicious war chief named Mamanti, who was his principal rival. Now, Kicking Bird's reluctant complicity cost him his life. As he saw the prisoners off with words of affection and with a promise that their imprisonment would be brief, which indeed it was, Mamanti hexed him. You think you have done well. You think you are free, a big man with the whites, Mamanti said, but you will not live long. I will see to that. The next morning, Kicking Bird died after drinking a cup of coffee. The army surgeon who treated him said Kicking Bird had been poisoned with strychnine. There had been a fatalistic element in Kicking Bird's struggle to maintain peace and come to some accommodation with the whites. In the unending hatred between whites and Indians, Kicking Bird had foreseen the apocalypse. I fear blood must flow and my heart is sad, he told a Quaker friend before the Red River War. The white man is strong, but he cannot destroy us all in 1 year. It may take him 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. And then the world will turn to water or burn up. It is our mother and cannot survive when the Indians are all dead. I'll close with those words of Kicking Bird and review with you briefly the 3 myths that I hope I've been able to debunk to your satisfaction today. The myth that the regular army was hell-bent on killing Indians. The myth that government Indian policy was exterminationist. And that myth 3, that the Indians united to resist the whites. So I hope I've left you a little less bewildered than our friend Dustin Hoffman was at the start of my talk. Here you see him even more bewildered at the end, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So with that, I will close my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening in. I hope you buy and enjoy my book, and come back for future book note presentations. Thank you very much.